now we've got that out of the way. Listen, thanks very much for turning up today. I came up with this idea of doing a quick talk on the rivers of the Belfast Hills with a bit of an emphasis on the history. But as I said to some of you earlier, I didn't realize exactly how many rivers we're talking about. You're talking about 10 main rivers, but at least half a dozen more that I'm going to try and talk about tonight, plus numerous other streams and rivers coming off various parts. So don't be too surprised if there's a couple of rivers that I don't manage to get talking about. When I say I'm talking about the history, I'm hopefully going to do dip in and out of everything from, let's say, the Ice Age right through, but with an emphasis on how important the rivers have been for the Belfast Hills and Belfast. I started off with this particular image is from 1933. Some of you may know Liganeel. This is looking down sort of southwest. That's one of the many mills that were up at Liganeel. You can see, if you know Liganeel Dams, there's one of the main mill dams. There's another one up here at the trees. There is a mill race coming down from what's very much a hidden river, the Forth River, flowing down just beyond those little haystacks there. And there's a mill race that's feeding these two mill races, plus a view right across towards the northern end of the Black Mountain. And just for interest, that the Forth River is coming across the upper section of that, but there's a house just the upper one to the far right. That's actually a house that John Dunlop, the guy who invented pneumatic tires, lived in. And we know that he was working in Belfast, but he actually lived up there. So I just noticed that whenever I thought this was a good old historic image of the mills up Liganeel, and a very important aspect of why the rivers are so important to us. Just to start, for those of you who aren't aware of exactly where we're talking about, the partnership, we're a whole all-embracing body of interest groups that are trying to manage the Belfast Hills better. And that's the line of hills that are along the west and north of Belfast. It's not a massive big area, but it's an escarpment, a line of hills that runs right down from Lisburn, right up towards Carnmoney Hill. And you can see in that map that we produced to show the publicly accessible areas, we have put the rivers in. Just try to do it a little bit better in terms of the range of rivers that we have. So you can see we've got four main rivers flowing out towards the west, which I've called the Lough Neagh rivers, that I'm going to deal with first. And then we've got at least six that are flowing towards the east, down towards the Lagan or the Belfast Lough, which I'm going to call the Belfast City, I suppose, the urban rivers. And I'm going to try and do them from, I suppose, the bottom left and right round in a sort of clockwise direction. So the first four Lough Neagh rivers, as I call them, are from the top. You've got the Flush, the Ballymartin, that's the one that flows up through Mollusk. Then you get the Clady River. That's one of the many rivers that are rising from Divis in the Black Mountain that heads over towards the northwest. Then you have the Crumlin, and then you have the Stonyford Glenavy. And I'll just go through those, starting with the Stonyford Glenavy. You can see you're not talking about a great distance from the Belfast Hills towards Lough Neagh. The bottom two flow directly into the loch. The top two go into the 6 Mile Water, which then flows into Antrim and then eventually into the loch. So these four are going right across what's quite an agriculturally rich ground. So it's now very much an agriculture area. But the bottom two rivers are flowing through the towns of Glenavy and Crumlin. And those two towns, to a certain degree, we're dependent on the river for their development. So we'll have a look at the very first one. That's the Glenavy River. It flows really from one of the key parts of the Belfast Hills, Slieve na Cloy. It starts off as a very tiny river called the Stonyford River to start off with. All these rivers have got about 3 or 4 different names as you travel down. It flows above Stonyford Reservoir, through Stonyford. You can see as it gets into the middle of its course that it's getting down to a flatter part of the ground, and you're starting to see it meander back and forth. It goes through Glenavy and then right into Sandy Bay, which in Rams Island. I think that's really only about 7 or 8 miles as the crow flies, but the river itself would be about a bit more than that, maybe anything up to 10 miles. So that's one of the very first rivers. I'll take a look at the second one to begin with, the Crumlin River. That rises in part of Divis and the Black Mountain, which is called the Head of the Waters. It's quite close to the Divis Road, where the bend takes you down towards Budore. So it's only a few hundred yards north of the car park at Divis. It then flows across the Budore Road, flows just north of Dundrod, and then flows south of Nuts Corner. Again, very flat area. That's one of the reasons why you've got Aldergrove and Nuts Corner. The airport's there. This is quite a flat area, and then flows through Crumlin and then into the northern end of Sandy Bay. If you take a look at the profile of this, of the how steep this area is, as you can on Google Earth. So that's the wrong way around, is it? Where that bit there, where the river starts, you can see it's much steeper. That's just generally true for all of the rivers of Belfast. This was a key aspect of the development of mills around the Belfast Hills. The earlier mills in the 1700s needed a good head of water, needed good slope. So a lot of the earlier mills were built right up in the foothills of Belfast, on both sides of the Belfast Hills. But later, as technology developed and as knowledge developed in terms of how they could use mill dams, mill races, hold back water, etc., you then had mills on the rivers further down, and that's quite a really interesting development of the line of mills that you get on the rivers along the edge of the hills. And then the mills are then, the older mills or the later mills are then built further down along the edge of the rivers. I'm dealing with the next two fairly quickly that flow into the 6 Mile Water. You've got the Clary, again, yet another river that starts up in Divis in the Black Mountain. Again, you can see how it meanders in the central part. That ends up going into the 6 Mile Water, actually a bit closer to Muckamore village than Dunadry. So it's a fairly short river. And then we have what starts off at as called the flush up towards the Ballyutoad Hill. It heads north. You have the Hyde Park Dam on it, and then it flows around the back of Mollusk Industrial Estate and then heads out almost parallel to them too. It's got the Patterson Spade Mill. You'll see if you're observant that that's not the only spade mill that we had in the Belfast Hills. And then it flows on down towards Temple Patrick. And that river valley and the 6 Mile Water Valley were very important historically. Great if you happen to have family history around there. They've got fantastic records going back to the 1600s, 1700s around that area. So that's a very quick gallop through those 4 individual rivers. The only other thing I'd like to point out about those rivers is that whole area, which we now associate with open fields and airports and flat area, that was at one time an extremely extensive ancient woodland, old woodland, oak primarily. It was so big that it was called Kilulta, which basically means Ulster wood. That virtually extended from the loch right up to the hills. There's another big wood on the other side, massive wood on the other side of the loch, Glencoe up towards parts of Tyrone and Derry. So this is whenever we had massive areas of woodland. And for anyone who wanted to travel from the loch towards the hills or vice versa, these rivers were a fantastic roadway. So when you had impenetrable woodland or areas, no roads, obviously, and anything like this here, whether you were the Stone Age people that were, at one time we believed came from, the first people in Ireland came from the north coast direction, came down the Bann. It was speculated that they built up numbers around Lough Neagh, and then they would have come up these rivers up towards the Belfast Hills in Belfast. We now think that it's probable that they came from other areas as well, and probably came from north down across, made the crossing across north down and then up the Lagan. Whichever way they went, these rivers were incredibly important in terms of transport. And that was true not just in terms of Stone Age, but for later times. When you had, for instance, in the 1640s, 1600s, there was always a concern that armies would follow these rivers right up into the hills and sort of almost by the back door attack Belfast and Carrickfergus. Let's have a wee look at, for instance, this is a map of Divis and the Black Mountain. This is the Crumlin River coming to an area called the Head of the Waters. And the distance between where that river starts and where the Colin starts is less than 1,000 meters. So even if you didn't know the area too well, if you're pretty savvy, you could come up a river, cut across probably a very boggy upland area, and then come down another river. And that's true for all the rivers that are meeting up in the hills. You can see that there's some rivers that are just within a few hundred yards of each other. Actually, here's one here. Here's Slieve na Cloy. This is the Stonyford River, and the distance between those two very small streams, obviously, is only about 500 meters. So it's no wonder that these were seen as important from a military point of view. In fact, this Stonyford River, if you look carefully, if you know Slieve na Cloy, you'll know that there's a strange earthwork up at Slieve na Cloy. There it is. And for a long time, we thought that this was a 17th century fort there to protect the passage up this valley, this river valley. And even though that river, you can jump across it, it's only about 3 or 4 feet, that would still be a way to guide yourself up and down through the hills. We actually have done a lot of archaeological digs there in association with Queen's University and Ulster Archaeological Society, and have found out that this was an area that goes right back to Stone Age times. But it could have been used as a military outpost. And we know that there were 4 forts built in Kilalta in the 1640s. And I would say that those are very much associated with the rivers. Also, as I mentioned, there was mills in both Glenavy and Crumlin in the later part, in the mid 1800s. I've taken this from a fantastic website, Glenavy History. I use that all the time for information, even though it's about Glenavy. It's got great amounts about the Belfast Hills. Here's one of the old mills that I'm talking about in Glenavy. It's got a double wheel. I think it's quite rare to have that. So these were being put out in the 1800s. Let's have a look at the Crumlin as well. So these were absolutely vital to the ways that Crumlin and Glenavy developed. And if you look right across here, you've got weir systems, you've got sluices, mill races, you've got a woolen mill, you've got a sawmill, viaducts, all sorts of works to maximize the power that these rivers gave to people. Be very careful when you read that there was a sawmill there and a woolen mill. Basically, these were engines, and the river gave us, it's equivalent to solar power or wind power today, I suppose, gave us, these were massive engines. If you could make money from producing wood, you'd make a sawmill, you'd have it as woolen mill, but don't be too surprised if you look at the later map and it's a print works or a flax mill. The one thing it definitely did generate is money for the mill owners, and quite often they lived in houses and estates just like at the top left here. So these were very important to not just the development of Belfast, but to the development of the surrounding towns and villages that the rivers went through. I'm going to then talk about what I would call the 6 city rivers. And I'm going to talk about a couple of them, then we're going to take a wee break for a couple of minutes. So we start off with at the northern end, a very small river called the Glass of Braddon. And then we have the Milewater. Blue is open and red is culverted. And you can see as we get further down here, the Farset River. Of course, it's famous for many reasons. It's virtually all culverted now, but it still has left its mark in terms of the history of Belfast. Then you have this massive complex called the Blackstaff River, and it is made up of a whole range of different rivers, and I'll show you in a minute why that would be the case as far as this particular area is concerned. Then we have the Colin River, and then we've got a little river called the Archaeology and Twinbrook. And even though these are very small rivers, it's amazing how many mills could be run on what's basically a river that you could step over. I mentioned about this whole complex of rivers coming off the Black Mountain. This is a view of the Black Mountain here. And where you have this steady wall, steep wall of hill, it's no wonder you get multiple rivers coming off this. It's fairly constant, except for one particular place where we have the Windy Gap. And you can see there's a line of trees down along the bottom, and then you have a rough, grassy, gorsy area there. The exception is if you're going up the Mona bypass, this little cleft here, well, it's not that little. You can see that it's full of woodland. There's a couple of bad photographs I've got here, but here's another view of it here. And be careful if you're ever going up towards this area here, because it's incredibly steep. Someone breaks their ankle going in to the Windy Gap every year. So it looks nice and gentle, but that's a very, very steep V-cut valley. And what has made that valley? You've got to think back to the Ice Age and the beginning of the end of the Ice Age, really. Whenever at one time, the whole of this valley that you see stretched out in front of you would have been covered in ice, and the ice would have extended right over the hills. You can still see the marks on the bare rocks and divots, etc., where these ice sheets moved. But whenever the ice was starting to melt, what would happen is you've got the ice blocking the whole of this valley. And in warmer weather, these massive lakes of melt water would gather up where the ice meets the top of the hill. And you've got this melt water sitting, massive amounts of it, sitting with nowhere to go. And if and when it finds a weakness between the rock and the ice, it will then start to pour out, and it'll pour out at a fantastic pressure. So you're getting what's called a glacial chute. And here's a modern example of how that might have looked. You get a fantastic amount of volume of water coming out with a fantastic scouring power. And perhaps over hundreds of years, on and off, you'll get this happening. And that's where you get a couple of places where you get really deep, steep little valleys, such as in the Windy Gap above Mona Bypass. But a much bigger version of that, of course, is Colin. So you get these very steep sides and these very worn channels. I didn't get a picture that could do this justice. There are parts of the Divis or of the Colin River and Upper Colin Glen where you've got virtually vertical walls up 10, 15 feet and the river going down in between it. And this is very much an indication of a lot of fairly constant and high-powered erosion. This is another image of what we're left with. You can see you've got very steep sides, and it's actually a really good picture to show why these rivers would have been important and such an important transport route in say Stone Age times. I'm not suggesting Paul's here is a Stone Age man, but you can see, imagine how difficult it is to go through that woodland. You can see all the fallen trees, etc., impenetrable woodland, and the rivers, when they're not in spate, offer a fantastic way of getting up and travelling right from, say, Lough Neagh toward the Lagan, etc. Let's talk about a couple of rivers, and then we'll take a quick couple of minutes break. The first one I want to talk about is at the very northern end. It starts by heading off in almost like a northerly, northwesterly direction off Colin Ward, which is the hill just north of Cavehill. You can actually see just a little hint of the Milewater down at the bottom there. But this is a very small stream. It never is very big, but it's very important from a historical point of view. It's one of those small rivers that's a key boundary between ancient estates. This would be the ancient Gaelic estate. So this is really the old boundary between Belfast and sort of Newtonabbey, Glengormley direction, Carrickfergus direction. If you wanted a boundary that was that would minimize fights, etc., you don't pick trees, you don't pick stones that can be moved. You pick a river. It doesn't matter how small it is. That's the boundary between one estate and the next. And those maintained those boundaries for probably thousands of years. So that's quite an important boundary river. Glasnevin, I'm not an Irish language expert, but that means the stream of the salmon. It starts off as a very small stream coming off this area, which of course has recently been bought by the Woodland Trust, and is already, those areas that can be planted up with trees are already being planted. There is just a faint trace there of the beginnings of a river, and if you take another look, if you notice this lane that's being built, there's the start of, who knows when the start of any river is, but there's the start of the visible traces of the Glasnevin. And these upper sections are vital in terms of refuges, not just for the river species that we get, the tiny trout that I remember we used to certainly get up on the Glasnevin, but also for trees and bushes. So you'll get, if you want to get really old vintage trees in terms of seed from those, there's no better place than to look at these little refuges along the rivers. And of course that also applies for other wildflowers, flora and fauna. And if you go further down, just a little bit towards close to the school there, might not look very attractive there, but you can see it's still very steep, so I just had to go in myself. This was just a demonstration of how much aquatic insect life there was. I look like I'm telling off that poor child there, but I'm only pointing out the different animals that we get. Some of our Belfast rivers can be quite polluted when you get closer to the Lagan, but even those, when you get right up into the hills, you have really clean stretches of river that are still of very high quality. And that means that if we can improve the quality of them lower down, we've automatically got those populations to head down into the rest of the river. So that's, you can see that's still a small stream there. It passes then through, it's culverted for quite a bit through Glengormley, then it opens up again, and there's a small river flowing through the Valley Park, and then it comes down to the Glasnevin Glen. It's a great wee spot. There's a lot of walking routes that are along for instance, the Valley Leisure Park, Glasnevin, and right on down. This is one of my favorite little bits of the Belfast Hills and below. It's a great little river flowing down through a lovely wooded area. The water quality is problematic. I know there are people here today could probably tell you a lot more about it. So we need to be ever vigilant in terms of the pipes and the material that's being put into that river, but it's still a great wee river. And it's a great wee river from a landscape point of view and from a heritage point of view. Where it eventually ends up is right down towards the M5. We are often, hopefully, assisting various groups who are doing a great job looking after their own patch. This is just a picture a few years ago now of the amount of rubbish and trash that we were taking out of that stretch of the Glasnevin. Just because there's a couple of supermarket trolleys in a river doesn't mean that it's not a good river. So always bear in mind how important our urban rivers in particular are for wildlife, but also for their own heritage. And they're the last refuge and marker of a landscape that's now been developed into an urban area. So that's a great wee spot. This is where it ends up. Gideon's Green. Some of you might know it, some of you might not. Flows into this large lagoon. You may not know that, but most people, when they're traveling up the M5 up towards Jordanstown, etc., you'll recognize this area here. Great from a bird point of view. That's the river coming in, the Glasnevin, very close to the White House, which is another historical feature. And of course, in the background there, we have Carnmoney Hill, our northernmost hill. And there's a little river coming off from that into the Glasnevin. And here's just a last little river to talk about before we have our break. This is the Milewater. It's quite an important river, but quite a short river. It's actually an undesignated watercourse, which I find hard to believe. So in terms of Rivers Agency, they don't particularly recognize this as a key designated river. It's not called the Milewater because it's a mile long. It's called the Milewater because it's a mile from the city centre. It was the marker for being a mile out from the city. And of course, it rises from some particularly important parts of the Cavehill, flows down through Cards Glen, flows through the waterworks. The waterworks were put there because of the river, and then flows under a pipe under the Antrim Road. I think it's about 160 meters, and then opens up again into Alexander Park. And there's a little bird called a dipper that actually goes up and down that 160 meters of pipe, which again shows that there is still wildlife in this little stream. This is quite important from a Cards Glen point of view. If you're up in the car park, you start a walk from the car park up an upper Hightown Road. After a couple of 100 yards, you'll hear on the left-hand side a little waterfall. But if you go over to the other side, not too close, because it's quite a drop, as you can see, there's quite a sizable waterfall heading down on the upper stretches of the Milewater. So it's a great little river. Historic, obviously. Cards Glen, Carr was the owner of one of the mills that we had on there, and it was amazing how they developed their technology so that what was a tiny little stream can power a mill of that size. What they actually did was they built a dam further up. They had a mill race that took the water along a much gentler slope over to the left, and then comes down a chute to power the wheel. That's a shot from the early 1900s. And again, that's a famous mill which was a print works. It was a flax mill. It was all sorts of different uses, but it was a big engine. that they were making the most of the power of the river. We're very lucky in that we have a LiDAR survey done of the Cavehill area by NIEA, and it's a great way to see the mark that the river leaves. You can see up to the very top, there's just a gentle mark of a very small river flowing down into the waterfall, and then you can see it really starts to cut into the fields. You can also see some of the quarries. Obviously, we've had an impact. There's the big limestone quarry, some of the smaller quarries here. I know it's a bit hard to see. I'll be zooming into the southern end a wee bit, but can you see there's a little, almost like a little triangle? That's the old dam. It's just out of the next picture, unfortunately, but you can see there's a sluice that comes down, that they would lead the water down here and then down. There's the pit for the wheel, that large wheel, and there's the remains of the mill. So that would have powered the wheel around there and down straight into the river. But what I really want to show you are two marked areas here. There's one rath. A rath is an early Christian farmhouse earthwork. There's another one there just on the edge of the houses. So these were two basically farmhouses with an earthwork around it, dating from, let's say, 500 to 1000 AD. And by that time, people had come off the hills and were starting to populate those areas in and around the foothills that were, number one, were good quality soil away from boggy areas, but number two, close to the river. So these are where people are living, and generally people like to live close to a good water source. So we've mapped out all the raths and past raths that there would have been in and around the river. You've got to be a wee bit careful because this is from 500, less roughly speaking, 500 AD to 1000 AD. So these mightn't have been a village they mightn't have been there at all at the one time, but we certainly had raths dotted around the Milewater and a lot of the other rivers. I'll just point out that other river that's close to Ballysillan Park. We'll be talking about that in the next when we're dealing with the next river. I think we'll take a wee 2-minute break there. Lizzie, are you still there?
I'll just unmute myself, and that'll help with life. So yes, we had a question came in, but we've also got very helpful people that help answer it too. So there was a little question about where do the Milewater and Farset flow into Belfast city centre under High Street ? We've got an answer here that says the Farset is under High Street, Milewater goes under Antrim Road to Alexander Park, then it goes into a culvert. I think the culvert runs into the Milewater Road.
Yes, and it also, there's a big mill down there. I can't remember the name of the mill, but it passes very close to that as well. I'll be talking about the Farset next, and we'll see bits of that. And I came across an amazing photograph that will explain. You can almost trace it via the names of the streets, but we'll talk about that. That's any other questions?
No, that's all the questions for now.
Right. Well, we'll take. You can see why. I hope I wasn't galloping too much through those. We've got 3 or 4 more. How much time have I spent there, Lizzie?
We're doing not too badly.
Okay.
So yeah, about 11 minutes past. So we'll give you another 20 minutes to finish us up.
Well, let me take a quick. Maybe I'll just zoom back to have a closer look at where the Milewater flows into. Yeah, very much. You can see that red bit there after Alexander Park. There is a mill. When you're next time you're going up the M2, there's a mill and chimney to the left, and it's very close to there. I'm pretty sure that also powered that, but it gets lost in the in amongst all the harbour buildings as we get further down. Okay. Shall I just bang on, Lizzie?
Yes, sorry, there's a couple of last wee things come through here. What is the river to the left of the Milewater called?
To the left, down below it, that's the Farset.
The Farset, okay.
Ask me again once I've been through this, and point out to me whenever we're going through that. Farset is, it rarely appears. It's very culverted at the present day, but I'll take you through that. And any other questions, Lizzie?
No, someone else gave us a very nice link in terms of having a look at some of the maps. Some seems to be an ArcGIS link document, so if anyone's keen, they can pop onto that. So thanks for sharing that with us.
And I've taken some of the images off. There's actually two. There's the Prony one, and then there's the historic map viewer one. I can't remember which department, but it's just amazing how much information's there, and I'll actually be showing some of the information that I got from that for the very last river.
Okay. Last big question in, it says, is it Jenny Mount Mill? I'm not
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. Yep. And you could, and it's the one thing about using those map viewers. I'll be showing you where some of the rivers, where I think some of the rivers have gone, but particularly whenever you're talking about rivers that have been diverted to make mill dams, sometimes these rivers have been changed 3 or 4 times. So to talk about where they used to flow or now flow, it's very, very difficult. And in a way, these maps are great. The other thing you'll also notice is that sometimes all of these are often boundaries to at least between townlands, and the boundary line will be on the maps will look quite different sometimes from the river itself, and that's because the river, these meanders aren't permanent and they change course gradually, and you might see that if I remember. I'll point that out in some of the maps. So even though they're good permanent ways to act as boundaries between various parishes, divisions, etc., things like this here, it does vary, and then that leads to questions as to, is that little bit still in or not? Any other questions, Lizzie?
No, I think at this stage we should probably get rolling for the rest of them. Thank you.
That's great. Okay, so I do realize that some people have asked about the Farset. Actually, this is I have to remember that this is a good example of stealing water here. First of all, the Farset starts up at Squires Hill. There's the Crumlin Road and the Bad Bend. When you go round the bend, round the Bad Bend, past Upper Hightown, and you're traveling out to the country, you look over to the right, you'll see this palisade, green palisade square on the upper side, the countryside of the road, with lots of Japanese knotweed, and that is the river starting to come in. It actually goes up a little bit more. Very hard to know whenever you start calling it a small ditch the river or not, but that's generally where it's coming from. It's pretty close to, there's Carr's Glen, and you'll see where the Milewater was, but you can see that someone at some stage has tapped water off the Milewater, use it to fill this reservoir and then to power this water. You can imagine the legal fights that there were about taking water off, about who owned what rights. Whenever they put in the waterworks and the previous Milewater was talking about, they didn't fully reckon that the Carr's Glen and their dam had rights to the water as well. So there are eternal fights in court about who takes what water, as you can imagine. Most of the Farset is red. Most of it is culverted. Tiny little bits are blue. You'll see as well that at the very bottom, there's a bit that I haven't joined into the lag, and that's because this is reclaimed ground, and this is where the Farset ended. You'll know that you've got the Albert clock sitting on what's reclaimed ground. Don't build a big tower on top of reclaimed ground. That's why the Albert clock started to lean. So that's beyond where the Farset used to be. Some of the few places where it emerges, you'll see there's that that area just above is that Ballysillan Primary School with the Rath. So again, the Raths are close to the rivers. As this flows down, it flows along the Ballysillan Park, used to be called the Buttermilk Loney. And then it takes a diversion into an area that's owned by Belfast City Council. It's called Lions Park, but there is no public access into it because it was donated by a man lion purely for nature and wildlife. But we do get access into that. Sometimes this is what it looks like, a tiny stream. Tiny stream. When you think of how many mills were powered by this tiny stream, there's me standing there. I think I'm holding some Himalayan balsam, one of the invasives, showing some of the people that we'd get in occasionally whenever we were trying to improve the site. So this is a small stream, lots of trees along this little valley that is goes down parallel to Ballysillan Park and then comes down onto Ballysillan Road. Now this is a traffic lights on the northern circular Ballysillan Road. There's the old Park Road coming on to join it. If you're ever coming down from Cavehill direction, down past the Cavehill Road, there's the big church here, and you're sitting in the traffic lights. You're probably sitting over the Farset. There's the river coming in from the left. It actually goes under one of these two shops. As far as I can work out, it travels in a pipe down along, crosses the road, down along somewhere around these houses, and you can just make out the outlet here, and it opens up again for part of the Ballysillan playing fields. Let's have a look. If you're at these traffic lights looking across, this is what you'll see here. You'll see the Happy Choice Chinese carryout. I should get a wee free Chinese for promoting this. And then you get this dog grooming boutique, and underneath one of these is the Farset. I just looked at when I looked at this photograph. You see that black line? You never know. That might be the pipe that takes the Farset. So that is all that remains of what would have been a free-flowing river around where the Ballysillan Park is. There's another river coming in called the Silver Stream into another part of the Ballysillan playing fields and joins up to that. So lots of little streams flowing down. The next place really that makes an impact flows right down towards this northern one is the Crumlin Road, and this southern one is the Shankill, and that's Tennant Street. And I've taken the top and the bottom of these so you can see them a wee bit better. This is the top here, and it's just chocker with spinning mills, corn mills, Crumlin Road, flax spinning mills. That's the Brookfield, mill races, and then as you get further down, spinning factory, corn mill and distillery, mill pond. Then you have Shankill Graveyard, Glenwood, corn and flour mill. So this, is there any wonder that this over the years, this dates from the 1850s, 1860s, and fairly soon after, all of these fields became mill streets. This is Tennant Street. The street up the hill, the next street up the hill that was going to appear would be Cambrai Street. Somebody was employed to buy the mill owners to build the houses for the mill workers along Tennant Street. It turns out it was my great grandfather-in-law that he then started. He started a business of building houses for the mills, and then by himself. Nobody knows where all the money went to, but suddenly, because of this rapid expansion of mills along these rivers, you had thousands of people working in the mills. And at the top of Cambrai Street, it's one of the best sculptures I think we have in Belfast of one of the mill workers. It's well worth taking a look around. Of course, all these modern buildings hide not just where the river is, but where the mills are. Actually across the road, you can still see the massive old Brookfield mills, etc. So this was just chocker with mills, and that's how you had not just the Crumlin Road and the Shankill, but also Falls, etc. All of these rivers suddenly leading to a massive expansion of industry. Along the Shankill graveyard, which is well worth a visit in its own right, if you go down to the far right of the Shankill graveyard, you will hear the Farset River. It's a big wall, and there's a river flowing along it, and it flows down towards, there's a church and a co-op undertakers, I think, but the river's flowing down to this bit here. This is what you see here. It's got that old basalt wall here between the church. You can see the railings of the Shankill graveyard over to your left, and that's where the Farset's coming in and culverted again, and it has one final appearance before it heads towards the city centre. There's the West Link. Some of you may know Townsend Street, and on it you've got the Enterprise Park. And lo and behold, good old Google shows us this open area here. And whenever we were helping with some Farset projects, managed to get involved. There's Des O'Reilly, who was mentioned as a great guy in terms of his knowledge of the rivers of Belfast, but also in terms of the fantastic books that he's written. He's leading a group along looking at this last stretch of the Farset. Who is that idiot standing there in the way? That's myself there. You can see there's a main body of water going down through that left hand exit, but there's also another exit going down towards the Pound River. I won't deal with that. I don't know very much about that. That was water taken off to head towards the Pound, as it were. Where does this then disappear? If you're coming out of Castle Court car park anytime and you're coming up to sitting at the traffic lights about to head out, if you look across the road, there's a church. I was talking to people in the church and they were saying that there's a couple of the rooms that they have that they can never heat. And that's because they've got a body of cold water continually moving under that room all the time. So it's coming through Millfield. There's another mention of Mills, of course. It's coming across. It sort of it sort of heads straight towards where we're waiting in the car, as it were, and cuts across to Bank Street. Bank Street is not named after a financial bank. It's because it's the bank of the river. And this line is going through, well, I had to put this image in. There's the guts of Primark. Isn't that an amazing image from Google Earth? And then it goes into High Street, as you were mentioning. So you've got Bank Street named after or in association with this Farset River. You've got Castle Street. You see Castle Street? Well, here's a much older, well, drawing of a much older time. This is the continuation of that river down High Street. That is supposed to be the original castle, maybe somewhere around British Home Stores. And here's the old town hall. We think of the city hall as being the centre of Belfast, but this really is where Belfast started to grow. It's quite a late developing town. And of course, these mills really powered their growth. But this gave a whole range of names to the streets around this area. Number one, you've got the little bridge across, so you've got Bridge Street. Then you have lower down, you have, it was big enough to have some of the ships going up. So you had both the skippers of the ships and the pilots going into the, living off the streets here. So you have Pilot Street and Skipper Street. Behind these trees, you have St. George's. It's a very old church. And basically that was that's where the Lagan came. So the area where Albert Clock, etc. is, that's all reclaimed land. And I don't know if you can see this, I can't really see it, but you see the hill up to the very top right? That's where the Farset's coming from. So that's the literal connection between the hills and High Street and the Lagan. And even though it's a smaller one of the rivers that we have, because that's where the city started, that's where Belfast gets its name. That's what many people think anyway, Belfast. Okay, so that's one of the key historical rivers of Belfast. We then move into this monster here, the Blackstaff River, which really is a multiple collection of the Ligoneel, the Forth, the Glencairn, the northern ones coming up from the north end of Divis the Black Mountain. And then you have a set of rivers coming from almost directly from the northern end of the Black Mountain. You've got the Ballymurphy, the Owenbarra, and the Windy, what I'll call the Windy Gap. I think there's another name for it. And then the southern end, you've got Ladybrook. So I'm going to try and deal with those in 3 sections. But there's a whole range of different features. Lots of dams, Ligoneel dams, Springfield dams, the city cemetery, which actually was the Glenalina mills before it became the cemetery. So you had a lot of a whole complex of mills being powered by those central rivers. And then, of course, you've got that Ballymurphy River flowing into the Bog Meadows. And then in the city centre, it flows more or less underneath the bus station. It flows through across Great Victoria Street, somewhere around Blackstaff House, which is BBC. Then it flows over, there was a bridge, so there's a bridge house, which is basically the Weatherspoons. And then it cut across parallel to Ormeau Avenue. You have Bankmore, the big bank along that. You had the site of the Joy's paper mill, and then it went out of the gasworks. And if you're down the gasworks, you see this big long pond at the Radisson. That's to mark where the river used to go. So that's a quick run through that. I'll deal with it in a bit more detail now. Let's go up to see, there's the Ligoneel, mostly and very recently culverted. So we're trying to make sure that these historic rivers aren't culverted, but there's the dam that I showed you at the first image. That's the Forth River. The upper stretches are extremely important from a biodiversity point of view. It's coming from the very northern end of the National Trust property. Very small stream there that cuts down through the Forth Glen. It seems to be that the Forth River was very much where the mills and mill workers were based. You've got the old Harmony cottages, a strong tradition that says that this was lots of different colors and different days of the week because the print mills were working there. So that was very much the working area. But the Glencairn River, where you had various houses of the mill owners and the rich, this was left alone, and this was very much a much quieter part of the Forth and Glencairn valleys. So there was quite a hive of industry
your
there.
time is just about up there, Jim.
Okay. What I'll do is I'll just take you very quickly through. That's feeding the Springfield Dam. It used to go underneath where the Belfast Met is. You have a small area close to the park centre, which is now open. If you ever zooming past the park centre, take a look between the park centre and the roundabout, and you'll see where that little river is. But you'll also see a number of Ballymurphy and small streams that used to power the Glenalina mills. And also you've got some of the small streams that go along the edge of Falls Park and then flow down through the Bog Meadows. These are all joining in close to that big roundabout, which of course famously flooded. And actually when you're driving along the West Link and you drive down into that dip, this river is flowing over your heads. It's in a big pipeway and just underneath that sculpture. Talk very quickly about you've got the Windy Gap River, and then you have the Ladybrook, which starts at the back of the Little in the Stewartstown Road. It's amazing how many places are joined up by this single river. Flows through the northern end of the Musgrave Park. If you're coming off the off slip onto the Balmoral roundabout to take a look, you'll actually see that river that then becomes the river that comes along the Boucher Road. This area up here, the village, was famous for flooding up until quite lately. There's the railway, There's the Windsor Park. And there's a picture from 1953, 17th of May, 1953. I have another picture that I couldn't find where you can see the sun off this big sea of water. This was very much a much bigger Bog Meadows, which is a famous part of Belfast until they managed to get, first of all, the Boucher Road and the West Link through. I'll talk very quickly about Derryaghy and Twinbrook. Twinbrook is these two twin brooks, and then you have the Derryaghy River. I'll just flick through this. The two rivers that make up the Twinbrook are one of the wee little stream come down the Bogstown Glen. It's a lovely little glen, but this is the Colin stream. This actually comes from a well up on Colin Mountain. It was an old religious site. There was an old bathhouse there, and it was another marker boundary river. They didn't take the Colin as the boundary between Belfast and Lisburn, in other words, the Donegal estate and the Earl of Hertfordshire estate. It was this tiny little stream that was the marker between those two big estates. This is a map from the late 1770s. Also shows a great view of Hannistown. I'll talk about that later. I'm going to keep going here, Lizzie. There's the Derryaghy River, another mill town, flows down through Milltown. A lot of this is still open until you get down towards Delorean. And the old maps that you were mentioning, again, you'll see loads. First of all, it's called Milltown, Mill Pond, Mill Races, Spade Foundry. This is the second old spade foundry that we had, Spade Mill. But you also see there's flax mills and ponds even off the river itself. And then when you go further down towards Seymour Hill, more weirs, more sluice gates, bleach greens, bleaching mills, and we're getting right into the heart of the mills of the Barber Mills and the Lagan Valley Mills. That's the Derryaghy River. Over to your right, you'll see the end of the next river, which is the Colin. This will just take a couple of minutes, he said. There's the Colin, flowing mostly off the Divis and the Black Mountain, but takes a big area of the watershed off the Belfast Hills. If you ever go across the boardwalk up on Divis, you're passing very close to the source of that river. It's flowing down through Divis and the Black Mountain, Upper Colin Glen Forest, and then down to Half Moon Lake. It's called all sorts of different names depending on where you are. People up the top just called the Big River. When it flows through Hannistown, it's called the Turnaround River. It's called the Colin with two L's when it's flowing in the Upper Colin Glen, and then Colin Glen Forest Park have got one L. So it's called all sorts of different things. And then people in Dunmurry call it the Glen River. You can see on those old maps, you have this strange structure. This is water coming off, being taken off, siphoned off the river and going into what's called the Half Moon Lake. There's the Weir Bridge up here, and there's a weir that takes the water all the way along and fills that then is the battery, as it were, to power the mill down at the bottom of Suffolk. And in more modern times, that's now piped under the Donegal Celtic Park, but you can still see the traces of that sluice. And that's a fantastic hidden spot. There's a view of it today, just off the Suffolk Road, and a lot of historical interpretation done on the site. It might only take 15 minutes to walk around, but it's well worth the visit. Then lower down, it flows through the Suffolk, down through the golf club, down through the Black's Path. We have the Dunmurry Dippers just down in that corner, believe it or not. So it's they're using the old historic weirs for modern use. If you're in Dunmurry, keep your eye out for this double bus shelters. You can see the signs for Lagan Valley. This is a lovely little park, Jubilee Park, that goes along what's then called the Glen River, not the Colin. And that's used today very much for interpretation. Where they're standing, that path is the old mill race that used to power the mills there, including the Beagling Mill. That river still is very clean. We get dippers on it, so we need to keep it very clean, and has a lot of industrial heritage. And I'll just finish by talking about, this is where the river goes down to the lag, and you think it's not very salubrious. It's down by the sewage works. But you see that little blue dot? This is one of those historic map viewer images that people were mentioning. That's the Colin. This is the Derryachy. They're both flowing down within a couple of 100 yards into the Lagan. This is a hill. And of course, when you take a closer look at that hill, that's it says a fine spot, but that has a major source of finds from the late Mesolithic, Neolithic, Bronze Age. The early people would have had this as a fantastic place to camp, and would have been able to fish and to make the most of 3 rivers. Here's an image from the works that were being done just whenever the sewage work were being put in. And you can see Mesolithic, numerous small Mesolithic blades. This is going back 9,000 years. Small Mesolithic axe heads, micro oils, tang and barb arrowheads, Teve Bulla axe heads. Those are those smooth axe heads. Neolithic scrapers, numerous flints, band flakes. I could keep going on. That's a fantastic source of information that's all been written up, and that's just one of the earliest finds that we have in Belfast, in and around some of the rivers that are coming off the Belfast Hills. So Lizzie, I know I'm 5 or 10 minutes late, but that's me. I hope that's been a very quick run through a load of rivers. I'm sure hopefully there's a lot of questions. Lizzie, anything coming up?
There's a few questions, some of which you've sort of answered as we've gone through, so I'll go quickly over. So which river flows through Riverdale in Andersonstown?
Oh, my goodness. I should know that.
Just
and
to
that's why it's
test your
called
knowledge,
Riverdale. Leave that one with me. I'll find that. I'll think of that one. That's just going along. Oh, that would be Ladybrook. Ladybrook cuts across into Malone College. Remember? There might be another little stream coming off Riverdale, but that's not too far away.
Okay.
We'll have a look later on. And can I mention one place, and it's not to shame anybody, but the Springfield Dam, there's a Farset International Hotel, and that's, people have mixed up. That's not the Farset, that's the Blackstaff. Of course, they could say that they weren't naming it specifically after that, but it's very hard when you see a wee stream to work out which it is. Of course, you can go back through the historic maps and then you'll find which it is. Keep going there, Lizzie.
There's another tiny one that might stump you here. What is the name of the tiny stream that goes into the Milewater via Ballysillan Road? It starts near Strandcool Park.
Yes. There's a couple up there, and I know that they're, this is just to divert away from that one because I don't know it. There's another couple. There's the one coming off at the zoo as well. There's multiple small ones off the Cavehill. Let's have a look at that one. I don't even know if that has a name, that one, but I know the one you're talking about. But I mean, even the Farset it's you don't have to jump over it, you can walk over it. So some of these are very, very small. So I won't be able to know all of them, but it's almost more important for you to look at what those maps are called, and then that'll give you an indication of where those are coming from. But it's amazing how a boardwalk up in Divis can be connected to right down towards parts of the city. These rivers all have an amazing way of connecting up these places. Keep going, Lizzie. I'm not doing too well yet.
They're here to test us. And there was a wee question just about where this is being saved once it's recorded. We have a Belfast Hills YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube, Google Belfast Hills Partnership, that's where it'll go. There's a lot of nice thank yous coming through. There's a little question about the Glass na Braden. It's the River of the Salmon. Oh, and it's now zoomed up past me. Let me scroll back. Too many comments coming in. And it's asking, would salmon have actually been in that river at any point?
Gosh, I'm going to be very wary of answering this in front of Andy Moore. I think so, yes. Salmon and trout come up the Colin. There's a lot of modern. See that weir that I flicked through showing you the Dunmurray dippers. Those can be quite difficult barriers for salmon and trout. But yes, I think salmon would have come up at least some way up that. Yeah, but certainly the trout are up there as well. We've released salmon and trout as part of our schoolwork in a number of other rivers apart from the Colin. We put that into, is the Derryachy River we put them into? Or the Twinbrook, yeah.
We've done the project a number of years, so depending on the river, we get advice from Rivers Agency about what we should be growing and what we should be putting back where.
Yeah.
Someone commented about the large volume of rodents associated with rivers and sort of saying, do you have any views about that?
Very, very much so. But remember all the rubbish that we pulled out of the Glasgow Braddon just for one? And not pretend that you get rid of the rubbish, you'll have absolutely, you'd call them rodents, we'll call them rats. Yes, we're always going to have, that's always going to be an issue, particularly in the built up areas. We have to think of how we're going to have a space for urban rivers. And you just need to be managing what the food sources are, but you will always have a certain number of rodents around rivers. You'll also have a number of stoats, foxes, other animals as well, and to a certain extent, and this might, without sounding too blasé, you've got to take the rough with the smooth, I suppose. But yes, that's an issue, and usually it's, if there's a big problem, it's because there's a management problem as far as that's concerned. Okay.
Great, thank you. There's a river I've never heard of, so apologies if I'm pronouncing it wrong. The Hay Innes River at the White Well. Does it run down to the Valley Leisure Centre?
Oh, I'd love to know what that is. Yes, there's a couple that are coming off there. I wonder if that's the White Well. I wonder if that's also the one that is coming off one of the rivers that flow down past the zoo. But there's also a couple of big springs on the lower end down towards Throne Wood that might be. How do you spell that, Lizzie?
Hainneys.
Goodness.
I'd never heard of it before.
There's some really interesting rivers over in East Belfast. There's the Marrock, M-A-R-O-K. That doesn't sound very Irish, but it is. And that's another heritage aspect of the rivers, what they were called. The Glasgow Braddon was also sometimes called the St. Bridget's Well. And one of the little streams that is flowing off is coming from Dunanny, which is the hill of Anya. And Anya is a god that's also associated with Bridget. So all sorts of historical connections. But I'd love to trace that name, actually. So thanks very much for giving me that. We'll see what we can find out as far as that's concerned.
Apparently it's near the zoo, as a sort of final comment that's come through about that.
Very good, very good.
Other people are congratulating you for actually being able to keep up with all the range of names of the streams and everything else. Okay. It's quite a lot.
Also, if you're going through the old maps, you'll see names. But I mean, Des would have been as fantastic as that. Owen Vara, I think, has got. It's quite actually similar to Blackstaff. Blackstaff seems to refer to the staff, seems to refer to footbridges and the staffs of wood that we use, but that's a bit of guesswork as far as that's concerned. Any other ones, Lizzie?
That seems to be questions drying up now. So I think maybe since we've run on about 15 minutes late, we should maybe call it a break now.
Did I see Martin raising his hand or somebody raising his hand there?
Oh, sorry. I don't have my participants view on here. I'm not seeing a hand raised in mine.
If anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, please, if they don't want to. Or have you had enough of rivers for one night?
We're going quite strong now on the rivers, Jim. So,
well, I hope to have a more manageable subject matter when I'm talking about the woods of the Belfast Hills. So I hope you can join us for that. Okay. So as you say, I'm happy to sit on here for another few minutes. If anybody wants to ask any other questions, etc. Okay. Anything else, Lizzie?
Last few things coming in. Just a lot of appreciation, some nice clapping hand symbols and things going on. So it sounds like we've got a few happy people. So that's great. Thank you everyone for coming
listen,
along.
I'm going to hang around for another 10 minutes if people anybody wants to ask a question in person. There's no problem, because I'd love to find out where these other Riverdale's getting me. I should know that actually, but we'll see as far